Hello, my presentation today is on the studies of video games linking to actual world violence. There are studies being done and studies that have already been done on this topic. They are trying to find a link between aggressive behavior being triggered by violent scenes in video games. The big question linking violent video games and aggressive behavior, scientists are trying to find the trigger in your brain that causes people to become aggressive when acting out aggression towards one another in these fantasy worlds that are video games. According to the American Psychological Association, video game play is linked to increased aggression in players, but insufficient evidence still exists about whether the link extends to criminal violence or delinquency. The research demonstrates a consistent relation between violent video game use and increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive cognitions, and aggressive affect. It also decreases in prosocial behavior, empathy, and sensitivity to aggression. Scientists have investigated the use of violent video games for more than 2 decades, but today there is very limited research addressing whether violent video games cause people to commit acts of criminal violence. But no single risk factor consistently leads a person to act aggressively or violently. In this chart on the left, it shows people from the ages ranging from 18 all the way up to 60. The blue represents the people who agree, both men and women. The orange is people who disagree with video games and computer games causing real world violence and aggression. The chart on the right is the same age group who agree and disagree that video games can be a useful outlet for relieving frustrations and aggression. And as you can see on the chart on the left, people who tend to play video games tend to disagree with their games causing them to act violent. Video game as an addiction. Video game addiction is described as an impulse control disorder, which does not involve use of intoxicating drug and is very similar to pathological gambling. Video game addiction has also been referred to as video game overuse, pathological or compulsive excessive use of computer games and or video games. Those suffering from video game addiction may use the internet to access massively multiplayer online role-playing games and multi-user domain games. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games are networks of people all interacting with one another to play a game to achieve goals, accomplish missions, and reach high scores in a fantasy world. A multi-user domain game combines elements of role-playing games, fighting, and killing in a social chat channel with limited graphics. Similar to other addictions, individuals suffering from video game addiction use the virtual fantasy world to connect with real people through the internet as a substitution for real-life human connection, which they are unable to achieve normally. Some suffering from video game addiction may develop an emotional attachment to online friends and activities they create on their computer screens. Those suffering from video game addiction may enjoy aspects of the online games that allow them to meet, socialize, and exchange ideas through games. Because some games require a large number of players to log on simultaneously for long durations of time to accomplish a game's task, players may feel an obligation and loyalty to other players. This may further the individual's justification of his or her use of use and sense of relationship with other players that are otherwise strangers. Statistics show that men and younger boys are more likely to become addicted to video games versus women or younger girls. Recent research has found that nearly 1 in 10 youth gamers from the ages 8 to 18 can be classified as pathological gamers or addicted to video games. The video game industry is approximately $6 billion a year market, with over 1 billion gamers worldwide. Video games are growing every year and becoming more and more violent with each game that comes out. A lot of people who play these games all day, every day, suffer from this increased aggression due to living in this fantasy world for too long. There have been 14 major mass murders in American history that can be pinpointed back to video games. One of them being the Sandy Hook Elementary. Adam Lanza was a frequent player of violent first-person shooter games. It was said that his existence largely involved playing violent computer games in his bedroom. His friends reported saying that he, Adam Lanza would play these violent video games for upwards of 8 to 10 hours sometimes per day. Another instant, Jared Lee Loughner from Tucson shot a man named Gabriel Giffords and killed 6 others in Tucson in January 2011. Both were mentally ill and avid video gamers. Another man named Eric Harris, based on his journal, a panel of psychologists, psychiatrists, and FBI agents point to Harris's contempt for others and his total lack of empathy and conscience as evidence of his psychopathic tendencies. Mr. Harris also was a violent video game addict. These men's crimes were all linked back to scenes from video games that they enjoyed playing on a regular basis. And a lot of people believe that these crimes were put into their mind because of scenes that they acted in a fantasy world. But nobody can prove that these men still would not have committed these heinous acts if they were not avid video gamers. Which leads to the next point, that violent crimes are committed and blamed solely on scenes from movies and or comic books also. For instance, James Holmes went on a rampage in a movie theater showing the new Batman movie in Aurora, Colorado in July of 2012. He was a frequent player of violent video games, including World of Warcraft and an infamously addictive role-playing game. But his crime he acted out was almost scene for scene from an old Batman comic book. People tend to blame the video games that are played by children and younger adults, but they fail to realize that even without these video games, we are seeing these violent scenes in comic books and on movies, and today even in some cartoons.